I'm Simon Rosenberg from NDN and NPI. We have a wonderful event today, a special event, really. And I want to, just before we get into the formal program, just want to, since this is being recorded, both by us and by C-SPAN, if we could just make sure that everybody puts their mobile devices on some setting that doesn't make noise, that would be great. We appreciate that. And let's get right to it, because I know it's a busy time and for many. But we're, as many of you know, I mean, for the 14-year history of this organization and its various incarnations, trying to help fashion a forward-looking economic agenda that responds to the incredible challenges that globalization is bringing has really been, in many ways, the core of our work. I mean, we're known for other things too, but I think that if you go back in the history of the enterprise, there really has been no more important work, and I would hope to believe that the place where we've made the greatest contribution over time is really helping with ideas and political heft from time to time and fashioning a new and better economic agenda for the country in a time of tremendous change. And so in the spirit of that, and for those of you who were here on Friday, we had a wonderful discussion with leading economists from the left and the right, looking at the fiscal and economic challenges that the country faces. Today, we have a very special guest, Dr. Jason Furman, who is now the #2 economic official in the White House. I mean, he's got lots of titles, but to sort of simplify it into plain English, is, you know, the principal deputy now, right? I want to make sure I get that right. Director of the National Economic Council, reunited with his old friend Gene Sperling, who have collaborated over many years. And let me just say a little bit about Jason and a little bit about the moment we're in, and I'm going to turn it over to him. And then he and Dr. Rob Shapiro, who's the chair of our Globalization Initiative, will be leading a robust Q&A after his remarks, so stay tuned. Dr. Furman, before he was in the White House, has taken leave from the Brookings Institution to take the original position that he had, and recently was just given the additional title of Principal Deputy Director of the National Economic Council. He's also the most senior, I guess, economist in that whole unit, in addition to being a very thoughtful political interpreter. He's a senior fellow. He was a senior fellow in economic studies and director of the Hamilton Project at Brookings. He began his career in public service during the Clinton administration as staff economist at the Council of Economic Advisors, and subsequently a special assistant to the President for Economic Policy at the NEC. In addition, he was a senior advisor to the chief economist and senior vice president of the World Bank, and he's also worked on research and in academia as a visiting scholar at NYU, at Yale, Columbia, and also as a senior fellow at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities and Brookings. He's conducted research in a wide range of areas, including fiscal policy, tax policy, health economics, Social Security, monetary policy, and he's published in a variety of scholarly journals and popular publications. And he also recently edited 2 economic policy books, I guess better than writing 2 economic policy books. He earned his PhD in economics and a master's in government from Harvard University, and a master's as well from the London School of Economics. And I just want to say that in a time of enormous economic challenge, when we just recently are coming out of what could have been a very serious global economic event, and faced with the double challenge now of really trying to craft an American response to the way that the world is changing today and the way that globalization is creating a much more competitive global environment. I think we are all lucky to have somebody with the knowledge and background and skills that Jason brings to the job, and it's really our honor to bring him to all of you today. Thank you, Jason, very much for being here.
I'll stay down here. We'll keep everything brief. Well, thank you, Simon, for organizing this, Rob for joining, and for everything that NDN does. The budget came out 8 days ago, so that was ample time for everyone in this room to have read it from beginning to end. So that will allow me to be somewhat briefer, assuming, of course, that has happened. And I recommend reading the budget itself rather than some of the commentary. You know, the last 2 years were really dominated by a macroeconomic imperative, which was an economy that was spiraling downward when the president came into office, losing 750,000 jobs a month. And while we did a number of important long-run things in areas like health reform and financial regulation, a lot of the effort, and especially when it came to fiscal policy, a lot of the effort was very much about creating jobs and stabilizing the situation in the short run. We're not past that in the sense that unemployment still remains unacceptably high. We have a long ways to go, but we definitely are moving in the right direction. We've put the right financial and macroeconomic policies in place, and we're beginning to see the dividends from them. So this is a budget that really very much pivots towards, as the president says, winning the future. And to do that, a lot of it is an investment agenda, investing in things like education, infrastructure, and innovation. And at the same time, doing that in a way that shows that we can live within our means and start bringing down the deficit. And to give some of the highlights from that, things like when it comes to domestic spending, a 5-year freeze, including a 2-year pay freeze, that would bring spending down to the lowest as a share of the economy since Eisenhower was president. In total, that's $400 billion of deficit reduction. In total, we have $1 trillion of deficit reduction over the next decade, of which 1/3 comes from the revenue side, 2/3 comes from the spending side. And some of the spending includes things like defense spending, which is $78 billion below the plan that was last year. I think it's important to contrast this $1 trillion of deficit reduction that the president is proposing with the Republican plans to date. Based on what they've said, they've talked about $100 billion a year of spending reductions. That $100 billion, if you assumed it extrapolated out at $100 billion a year, would be roughly $1 trillion over the next decade. Question is, what is that $1 trillion going towards? It's actually not going towards reducing the deficit. It's going to pay for two things that the Republicans also want to do. One of them is to continue the tax cuts for high-income households, which would cost $800 billion, plus the estate tax over the next decade. And the second thing is to repeal health reform, and that's a repeal that the Congressional Budget Office has said would cost a little bit more than $200 billion over the next decade. So to date, based on what the president has put out, which is a detailed beginning-to-end plan, which cuts the deficit by $1 trillion over the next decade while making very important investments, so that I'll talk about in a moment, you have a contrast between that, investment and deficit reduction, and what to date has been the Republican plan, which is very deep spending cuts, but those spending cuts aren't actually reducing the deficit. All they're doing is paying for tax cuts for high-income households and paying for the repeal of health reform. Now, I stress that's the Republican plans to date. They could come out with additional ideas. They could have additional proposals, but so far, those ideas aren't ones that would actually reduce the deficit. So at the same time that the president's doing this $1 trillion of deficit reduction, he's also making very important investments in the future, and just wanted to very briefly highlight a few of them, and we could talk about more of them in our conversation. One area is education, and in some places that means keeping what we have, which is the maximum Pell Grant, which is helping 9 million students afford college. In other areas, it's setting ambitious new goals, like 100,000 new STEM teachers. A second area is innovation, where we more than double energy research, on a path to doubling NSF, and other areas make the R&D credit permanent, and an idea that actually NDN and Dan Carroll really helped us come to is growth zones as a successor to empowerment zones, but improved in a number of ways. And finally, infrastructure, where we have a 6-year reauthorization of surface transportation, be the wonky term for it, but it incorporates things like high-speed rail, like an infrastructure bank, and then also a wireless initiative with the goal of high-speed internet for 98% of the country. And that's a wireless initiative that actually, by better allocating our spectrum, would reduce the deficit while making those investments. this is a deficit this is a budget that doesn't claim to solve all of our long-term problems. If all of this was enacted, we would roughly stabilize the debt to GDP ratio over the next decade. We would bring down the deficit, as I said, by $1 trillion, but we would continue to, in the so-called out years, have a rising deficit as a share of GDP and a debt increasing as a share of the economy. So that's why we describe this as a down payment and want to work together with Congress on the areas that are really driving that long-run situation, which include things like health care and include something like the President put forward of cutting tax expenditures for high-income households in order to reform the tax code and reduce the deficit. So that's where things are right now. We obviously just put the budget out. That's the beginning of a conversation. At the same time, we're also having, obviously, a conversation about last year's budget, which was for FY 2011. But we're really trying to keep our focus on growth, on jobs, on innovation. An important part of growth is that will bring down the deficit, but bring down the deficit over the medium term is a very important thing that we can do as well for economic growth. So we view those two as complementary objectives. So with that, happy to.
Thank you, Jason. Jason, we can see the economic logic embedded in the President's program of pairing gradual deficit reduction with investments in elements of growth that cross industries and sectors, education and training, innovation, infrastructure, so that the public investments can raise the rate of return as more capital is being freed up by the gradual deficit reduction, and then you get a big boost in business investment and hopefully employment. We can recognize it because it's much like the Clinton program. What are the economic implications of the Republicans' approach?
You don't have a complete approach right now, but the concern you'd have is you wouldn't want a plan that is starving future investment, that is reducing investments in education, reducing investments in innovation, not moving forward on innovation. And the worst of all worlds is if you're doing that as a way to pay for tax cuts for high-income households and to repeal health care rather than doing all of that to reduce the deficit. So we don't have any debate with the Republicans about the need to cut spending and live within our means. But what we want to make sure is that we're doing it in a responsible way that's investing in the future and bringing down the deficit. And I think that's the crux of where things, where things lie.
One other question, and then we can get questions from the audience here today. And that is, at last week's event here, we had Stan Collender and Kevin Hassett and who am I forgetting, Simon? Myself and Bill Gale, your former colleague, from Brookings. One area in which there was more uncertainty across the panel than some was the economic implications of problems with the debt ceiling. How do you see that?
We fully expect the debt ceiling to be raised. It's something that congressional leaders from both chambers, from both parties have said, that the president, is obviously, takes them at their word and thinks it will be raised. So this is not an issue that we expect to have to face. Secretary Geithner wrote a letter where he outlined some of the consequences if it weren't raised. And I think it is good that people seem to appreciate that. And it would have, huge, long-lasting ramifications for the United States economy, for our ability to fund our government for the many obligations the government has, which aren't just to our creditors, but to our senior citizens, to contracts that the government writes with people for goods and services, as well as the types of investments we'd make. So it's for the most part unthinkable, and that's why, as I said rightly, everyone has rejected it as a thought.
One last question, sorry, but it's just occurred to me. This is a period of really historic transformation in the Middle East, and we are now seeing the unrest spread to significant oil producers. In the case of Libya, certainly, and we don't know what the next step is. The beginning, at least, had been limited to areas that are relatively minor in oil production. Is there concern? How great is your concern about the impact of these events on oil prices and the impact of oil prices on the American recovery?
Yeah, I mean, that's something we're obviously monitoring very closely, both the national security situation, but also the impact it would have on oil markets and on our economy. The American economy is a less oil-intensive economy than it used to be. So oil prices still affect us adversely. They still affect consumers at the pump, but not to the same degree that they did in the past. The same thing when you look at something like commodities prices in the area of food. American consumers are not completely insulated and do bear some of the brunt of those commodity price changes, but a lot of the cost of food in a country like the United States is the wholesale distribution, the retail distribution, the packaging, the manufacture, a whole bunch of things which aren't affected by global prices. So it's something we're monitoring. It's something that shouldn't be the type of event that throws the American economy off track in a significant way. But certainly commodity price increases do increase the challenges consumers are facing, just as the economy is trying to really get off the ground and grow.
Jason may not say it, but I will say that certainly the risk of that is another reason to be very wary of Republican attempts to slash spending in the current year. You don't have to comment on it. Why don't we take some questions from all of you?
And we need to use the mic, so raise your hand. And for C-SPAN and for posterity, please say
Is there anything else you'd like me to ask?
Politics Daily. There's been a lot of clamor for the president to show leadership on the long-term debt and deficits, and he's not proposed anything yet. I'm just curious about the calculations behind that. What are the political upsides and downsides, given that you've been dealing with a Republican Congress that says no to almost anything? I mean, is that part of it? And what else can you tell us about the approach and the timing and what's going on behind the scenes?
Right. I guess I'd reject the premise of that question, which is, first of all, for the last 2 years, the president has shown leadership. Something like health reform is the most significant deficit reduction that we've undertaken in this country in over a decade. And as a result, although we continue to face a long-term challenge, that long-term challenge is a lot smaller than it was last year. You can look at, for example, the Congressional Budget Office updated their long-run budget outlook, and it incorporates the effect of health reform. And that you'll see the long-term deficit fell by about 2% of GDP as a result of that reform, or in the dollars we usually talk about, $1 trillion over the second decade. So I reject that premise for historically. I reject that premise going forward, in that the president put out a budget with a lot of tough choices certainly heard criticism from across the political spectrum about some of the choices that were in the president's budget. And that's a budget that satisfies the goal that we've basically had for the last 2 years, which was to figure out how to get the deficit down to about 3% of GDP in the medium term, to stabilize the debt to GDP ratio over the medium term. A year ago, our budget didn't do that, and so we called for a fiscal commission to bridge the gap between our deficits then, which were about 3.5% or 4% of GDP, and where we wanted to be. This year, through the additional things we did on the discretionary side, on the defense side, new things like unemployment insurance, solvency, PBGC reform, FHA reform, a whole bunch of other areas, we achieved that medium-term goal. So the President's put out a major down payment. If we were to adopt it, from beginning to end, it would be a significant contribution to our fiscal policy over the next decade. But as I said, doesn't solve all our problems, so we still want to leave some room for Congress to work together with us as well.
Hi, Jason. My name is Lemon Boozer. I have a question for you. What is your opinion on the current state of the economy?
We've seen 6 consecutive quarters of GDP growth. We've seen a year of job growth. Normally recoveries are pretty bumpy, gets better, gets worse, gets better, gets worse. We've been lucky enough to see the pattern that pretty much every quarter has been stronger than the last in terms of job growth, and most every quarter is stronger than the last in terms of GDP growth. That's looking backward. Looking forward, it's important to recognize things like the tax agreement we reached in December. Most of the forecasters were forecasting growth of around 2.5% before we reached that agreement. Since it, they've raised their forecast to, in the neighborhood of 3.5% to 4% economic growth. People are expecting about 1 million extra new jobs as a result of that tax agreement. And you see that because consumers are spending, but you also see businesses increasing their investment due to things like the expensing provision, and companies like the one you work for and others have cited that as a reason why they're able to invest more in the economy.
Could you tell us what role you think the global economy will play in the American recovery?
Mm-hmm. The global economy is, unfortunately, the main role it's playing is a risk, is more of a role of a downside risk than an upside opportunity for us. And it's one that, based on what you'd expect right now, our growth will be robust enough. Our exports are continuing to grow. The world is continuing to buy our goods and services. We're on track in terms of the National Export Initiative's goal of doubling exports by 2015. So the hope is that it will continue to play a role in helping get ourselves out of this. Really, consumption and exports are the 2 main places to look, because investment isn't going to be the biggest driver of how we get out of the cycle, and certainly not housing investment. But there's certainly more ways in which that could turn negative from our expectations than turn positive from that.
Please turn off your phones.
Tax policy question for you. The President mentioned in the State of the Union, and Treasury Secretary has testified on the Hill recently regarding the possibility of corporate tax reform, and that was not part of the budget, unless I missed it. I just wondered, particularly given the success that the President had on this issue area reaching across the aisle in December, as you noted, what the status of this proposal is. Is this something that the President is going to advocate aggressively, and how would the issue relate in any way to, strategically, to discussions relating to long-term deficit and debt reduction issues?
So in the budget, we put forward a bunch of specific ideas. when it came to corporate taxes, those were very similar to the ideas that were in the last budget. Those are all things that we continue to think represent sound economic policy. But at the same time, what we've said is there may be an opportunity to do something much bigger and much more fundamental than what we put down there. And if we were able to do that, we'd be willing to do it in a way that was revenue neutral, that didn't. We wouldn't be asking for corporate tax reform to reduce the deficit. We just would be stipulating that in an era of very tough budget, it can't increase the deficit. And at the same time, making it clear that it would have to contribute to growth, simplicity, stability, increase investment in the United States. So that is not an explicit, we figured it all out, here's our corporate tax reform plan, but it's a dialogue, and it's one that we've been having with leaders in the business community, that we've had with experts, that we've had with both Democrats and Republicans in both the House and the Senate. So we're still very early on in those discussions. It's something that the President is personally very enthusiastic about. Certainly heard from an awful lot of CEOs who correctly say that the rest of the world have cut their tax rates, and that the United States is left with currently the second and soon to be the highest tax rate in the world, and that interferes with our competitiveness and the ability of our companies to create jobs here in America. No one can defend our current international tax system. You might debate the best way in which to change it, but from scratch, no one would construct what we have today in that area. And but at the same time, our high rate isn't a measure of our companies being overtaxed. We're about average in the pack. By some measures of effective tax rates, we're actually low because we have things like more generous depreciation allowances. So that high rate is really a measure of how inefficiently our companies are taxed. And so that means there's an opportunity there to eliminate some of that inefficiency, simplify the tax system, broaden the base, bring that rate down. And that's something we're very enthusiastic about. We'd like it to emerge from a set of discussions rather than start the conversation by putting our ideas forward. So.
Hi, thank you. Ken Wash with the Software and Information Industry Association. Some of the criticism that comes from the Republicans, and I don't watch Fox News regularly, but you hear the repeated attacks on the administration. There are two that I'd like to hear your response to. The first one is that you're in the process of reducing the budget from a very high level of 2011, and that while some spending may have been necessary to stabilize the economy, there's little excuse for the inflated budgets of departments like Justice, EPA, Commerce, Agriculture, and that we're cutting those budgets down from inflated levels that have inflated since Obama took office. The second piece is one that we hear frequently from the other side of the aisle, especially among folks in the Tea Party, who argue that the fundamental tax structure is unfair today because 47% of Americans pay no income tax, and they really have no stake in America. How would you answer both of those criticisms from folks on the other side of the aisle?
Mm-hmm. So the first question is, I would just point to our budget, which is we take spending to the lowest share of the economy since Eisenhower was president. And that was a long time ago. And that is the way I think most economists tend to make, of any party or perspective, make comparisons of spending over periods of time. So we have a very tough budget that brings down spending a lot. I'm sure we needed to increase spending both to deal with the recession, and then you have things in the discretionary budget like Pell Grants, where you have a lot more students that go to college, in part because of the economy, so that goes up. A number of things throughout the budget, even though they're discretionary, actually are affected by the economy. Veterans falls under non-defense discretionary, and a lot of that is healthcare. And when the costs of healthcare go up, just having that grow with inflation or be flat in nominal terms isn't going to help you continue to provide the same level of services that you were in 2008. So some of that is a lot of different items there to do what you were doing before, you need to increase as a result, which is why people look at a shared economy and why we're bringing that down to the lowest since Eisenhower. And again, you can just sort of look, and we put out examples of LIHEAP and community programs and others, a lot of things that are being cut by a lot, and there's another 198 examples along those lines, totaling $33 billion. In answer to your second question, I guess one question I would ask the Tea Party is their proposal that they'd like to increase taxes on 47% of Americans. And that would seem to solve the problem as they have identified and defined it according to your question. And if that's so, that would be an interesting debate to have. And whenever I read op-eds along those lines, that's exactly the question I have. Is this person, why don't they just come out and say they want higher taxes on 47% or whatever percentage of Americans it is? Obviously, people pay payroll taxes, they pay state and local taxes, and people's circumstances vary. A lot of those people are students or people who recently retired or what have you, and looked at over the course of a life cycle, the number isn't anywhere near that. So you can even, Peter Orszag, Lily Batchelder, and Fred Goldberg had a clever paper on refundable tax credits a number of years ago that argued that to some degree they were like a carry forward and carry back, which is totally standard and acceptable when it comes to corporate taxes, as it should be. And refundable credits was, in a sense, extending that principle to individuals who had paid taxes in the past or would be paying taxes in the future, and we're going through a temporarily lower income time because of life cycle or because of hard times.
Hi, Sam Stein with the Huffington Post. First off, I want to let Rob know my ringtone is off, so you...
Pardon?
My ringtone is off, so you don't have to worry about it. You touted the economic benefits of the tax cut deal that was reached during the lame duck session, and I'm wondering, there's grave concern that by simply extending it for 2 years, you're going to keep on extending it. If the economic conditions in this country haven't improved demonstrably in 2 years, is the door open for the White House to further extend the Bush tax cuts for the upper income classes because of the economic impact that you cited they had this go-around?
Right. The President's been completely clear that the 2-year extension of the reason for those economic benefits I talked about was everything the President secured in the agreement. The payroll tax cut, the 100% expensing, the refundable tax credits, unemployment insurance. Those are the reasons that forecast increase, and that isn't just my argument. Part of why we know that is most of the forecasts actually already were assuming the high income were going to get extended. That's what most economic forecasters thought in the beginning of December. The news to them was that the President fought for and secured all of these economic measures. He's been crystal clear. He didn't want them then. He didn't think, even in the economic circumstances we had 2 months ago, that the high-income tax cuts were an appropriate or remotely cost-effective way to deal with those problems. And so that answer won't change 2 years from now. No, he will not extend those, won't have those extended. There's no economic circumstance in which the high-income tax cuts make sense.
There was an op-ed today from Beheader Lou about Social Security not contributing at all to the deficit problems. Is the White House's position formally now that Social Security reform is ostensibly off the table as people conceive it for the next couple of years?
I think if you look at what the President said in the State of the Union, what he said in his press conference last week, what Jack said in his op-ed today, the Social Security challenge is not one that you care about because you're worried about our long-run fiscal future. It's a very small contributor to that. The reason you care about it is because you want to strengthen Social Security. It's such a critical part of our social insurance, bedrock of retirement security for senior citizens, one of the leading anti-poverty programs for children, critical support for people with disabilities and other survivors. And for all those reasons, and the fact that it's solvency is the period in which it can pay full benefits is another 26 years through 2037. The real motivation is strengthening a program like that, and the president talked about, what he would and wouldn't do in that, and not slashing benefits, not hurting the basic benefits of current retirees, not privatizing the system, and making sure that if you're doing it, you really were strengthening it and improving those perspectives. So I think that's the way you want to understand that, is we don't see this as part of the solution to the long-run fiscal challenge, but it remains important for the sake of Social Security itself.
I just wanted to ask about, you mentioned the $1.1 trillion in savings, but that's against you guys' adjusted baseline. The regular CBO baseline for years has been looked at as sort of like not counting during the time when the tax cuts were not, before the tax cuts expired, before the extension. What I'm trying to get at is if everyone's not sure by what measure to measure fiscal policy by, doesn't that mean at some point you need to just go back to the CBO baseline to measure your fiscal policy versus the GOP's fiscal policy? Isn't there a certain confusion in the air by everyone wanting to use sort of different baselines to measure their fiscal rectitude?
Mm-hmm. First of all, this is like a topic I could talk about for hours, but I will try my hardest not to. Some of the differences I talked about between the complete plan the president's put forward and the parts of a plan that the Republicans have put forward to date, the $1 trillion difference between those is obviously unrelated to any baseline you choose. So that basic contrast holds true regardless, number one. Number two, I think, you could make an argument, and the baseline that's been used by everyone from the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget to Goldman Sachs to the administration in the last 2 years assumed all the tax cuts were continuing. If we had used that, we would have claimed an extra $1 trillion in deficit reduction from not allowing the high-income tax cuts to continue. We decided that given the passage of statutory pay-go and a shift in the framework, that it made sense to shift our baseline in light of that. So we're not actually taking credit for that extra trillion that, under other circumstances might have been perfectly reasonable to take credit for. The problem with the CBO baseline is I don't think anyone thinks it's remotely realistic to think that all the tax cuts, the AMT, the SGR, every one of those things is going away. So we tried to make a set of adjustments largely grounded in statute that Congress passed, statutory pay-go, some additional adjustments for anomalies beyond that. But the most significant adjustments we made were based in a law that Congress passed and the President signed. But regardless, none of that changes the basic story, which is that we stabilized the debt to GDP ratio, which is not where we are today.
Hi, Richard Goodstein. Two quick questions. We've heard it said by the president's opponents over and over countless times that the claim was that before the stimulus, unemployment would be capped at 8% if it were enacted, and the answer is, well, the economy was much worse than we thought. That's why we made that claim. We're going to hear it countless times more, probably including in whatever debate the president has in the fall of 2012. Is that his best answer, that the economy was worse than he thought? That's question one. Two, competing claims on why these trillions of dollars are sitting on the sideline. You hear people in the business community say uncertainty. You hear economists say lack of demand. Do you see any objective support for one position or others, so it's not just this rhetorical clash that seems to be kind of accomplishing that?
Mm-hmm. In answer to your first question, sure in a year and a half we can figure out exactly what the best line to use in a debate is. The actual truth is you look at every forecast that every forecaster made back then, and you compare it to that Romer Bernstein paper you referenced, and their baseline absent the stimulus unemployment rate was basically the same as what all those other forecasts had. So this was something, even the most pessimistic forecasters were, they had an unemployment rate a little bit above that line, but nowhere near what we eventually saw or counterfactually would have seen. So that's the truth. I mean, the baseline forecast that was done there was grounded in what everyone was projecting at the time. Certainly most of the people who've gone back and looked at the effect of the Recovery Act and the other fiscal measures say it made a huge difference in terms of what the unemployment rate was when you take it together with the financial stabilization. The best paper on that is by Alan Blinder and Mark Zandi. And, I think they said you would have had something like a 15% unemployment rate. So the other thing people will see now, and we'll see more a year from now, is that the economy's growing. It's creating jobs, over 1 million last year. That pace will accelerate this year. And so a certain amount of the proof will be in the pudding, not, some paper released in January, 4 years ago claimed such and such, but, what's actually happened? Are you moving in the right direction or wrong direction? We're definitely moving in the right direction right now. In terms of your second question, I actually think it's interesting. I have seen the uncertainty argument made much, much less frequently in the last few months. And maybe that's a whole bunch of reasons one could imagine for that. So that's not actually the dominant. I don't even feel like that's one of the dominant arguments anymore. Certainly I'm more partial to demand as an explanation. The reason for that being that most of that capital is in sectors of the economy where it's hard to imagine regulation or the other set of issues having quite as big an impact as anyone would say they would. And the fact that a year ago it was perfectly rational for someone not to invest because they were concerned about the future of the economy. I think it becomes less and less rational over time, and possibly reflecting that fact, you actually saw for the first time that total amount of cash sitting on the sidelines actually fell, and we're certainly trying to give it an incentive to fall through things like expensing of business investment, as well as support for aggregate demand through things like the payroll tax cut. But it's a good question in terms of the evidence on those hypotheses.
Let me interject one point that's a little more partisan perhaps than Jason will be comfortable with, but if you want to see the impact of the stimulus and of this particular kind of stimulus, compare the jobs record for the first 18 months of this administration with the first 18 months of the Bush administration. They both came in with recessions, although the Bush recession was the briefest and mildest in the post-war era, and the one that the president had to deal with was the longest and deepest in the post-war era. If you look at the whole 18-month period, on net, we've created, I think, about 750,000 jobs after we lost 1 million and then created 1.7 million. In the first 18 months of the Bush administration, they lost 1.7 million jobs. Jobs kept on being destroyed, private sector jobs, for over 2 years, despite the very large but entirely tax-driven stimulus of the Bush administration. So by any measure, the jobs record and the record of responding to a downturn of the Obama administration is leagues superior to the approach used by the Bush administration. Sorry, Jason. If we could have another question. Yes.
I'm Mac Dessler, University of Maryland. Just about all the commissions that have looked at the deficit medium long term have suggested that something more substantial is going to have to be done with revenues, including perhaps raising income taxes directly or indirectly for that sacred 97% of the population that the president has so far held harmless. I would mention that at the University of Maryland, we've done a study survey randomly selected citizens who have been asked to address the discretionary deficit and have ended up going line by line and have both reduced spending substantially but increased taxes, including on all income groups, more substantially, twice as much. So that this suggests that there might be more public readiness to do something on the tax front than both parties, particularly Republicans, seem to feel. But my question is, the Bill Simpson people seem to have offered a nice, though very complicated way out, which is radical tax reform. And so you actually can maybe bring down the rates, but get more revenue because you really go after just about all tax preferences. Is the president and his people going to push this behind the scenes, or are you just going to sort of hang around and see if the Republicans come up with it?
Right. I mean, certainly the president put forward a budget that achieves our medium-term fiscal objective and does it while being consistent with his promise not to raise taxes on households below, well, $200,000 for a single, $250,000 for a married couple. So he's shown how it could be done. Now, one of the elements that he does is something you could think of as like a down payment on tax reform, which is he takes the tax expenditures for high-income households in the form of their itemized deductions and limits the value of those itemized deductions to 28%. And that was an idea that didn't get a whole lot of congressional interest, I think it would be fair to say, in the last 2 years, given our fiscal commission and others' interest in the issue of tax expenditures. That might be a ripe, easy place for people to begin their re-examination of that question by looking at that proposal with fresh eyes.
Let's have one more question. This is, after all, one of the busiest men in Washington. Yes.
Hi, Ken Levinson.
That would be because most of the White House is in Ohio today.
Well, at least because Gene is out of town.
Hi, Jason. Ken Levinson. Maybe a corollary question to some of the ones that have been asked before, but should there be a protracted budget stalemate or a delay in raising the debt ceiling, what might be the impact on both economic growth and job creation in the near-term and long-term future?
Right. You know, again, I mean, for a shutdown and for the debt ceiling, I mean, it's pretty much the same perspective, which is the congressional leaders have said they don't want that to happen, that they don't expect it to happen. The president certainly doesn't want it to happen and certainly doesn't expect it to happen. There are obviously some differences of opinion, and you know, those are issues you know, that will have to be worked through, so we don't think it would come to that. In terms of the real difference for the economy that I'd focus on, though, is number one, what does it mean to short-term growth if you're making very large cuts in the budget very abruptly this year when job growth is starting to strengthen but isn't so strong that it could sustain a very large movement in the opposite direction. So I would focus on that question, and then the other question is, what are you doing for medium and long-term growth in terms of the investments you're making in the areas I began with, innovation, education, and infrastructure. So I think those are the important economic questions and debates, and you know, the other things are things that you know, we certainly believe we shouldn't have to get to or find out the answer to.
So, Jason and Rob, thank you so much. And I just want to make one observation before we go, and it was based on a question that was asked earlier, is that it seems like so much of the debate right now between the Republicans and the Democrats is in some ways dependent upon how you determine what the actual economic challenges are and what problem you're trying to solve. And so let's just review some basic data as a way of ending this discussion, which is in the last 11 years, right, we've had no wage and income growth in the United States. We've seen a shrinkage of the middle class, that wealth itself has been highly concentrated among a smaller number of people, that we've seen a terrible global recession and financial crisis here in the United States. We've seen the rise of economic tigers all around the world who are going to be creating much more global competition for our workers and our kids and our companies than we faced when we were growing up. And the response of the two parties to all that, right, if you just from a basic, so here's the landscape, And obviously deficits have increased, right, largely through what's happened with the recent recession, this sort of significant recession. So you have a whole bunch of economic challenges, and the president has come out and said, you know, we need a strategic response to these series of extraordinary challenges, and talked about future growth and investing in the parts of the economy that need to grow to make us more competitive, to take the deficit down over time, to make sure that at a time when our workers and our kids need more skills and more knowledge than we have, we're giving them more and not less, right? You go through the whole series of strategic responses to this economic set of challenges we have, and you see coming out of the White House a very thoughtful, serious, right, long-term strategic response to our current set of economic challenges. And look at what is coming out of the Republican Party, right? We just have to cut the deficit. We have to cut spending while increasing the deficit, by the way, right? I mean, this is my favorite thing, is that there isn't actually an economic strategy coming out of the right that actually reduces the deficit because of their adherence to high-end tax cuts. And it is an anemic strategic response to a set of extraordinary economic challenges that we face. And I think that part of, for those of us who are debating this out and you heard some of the questions today about this, is that a lot of this depends on how you define what the problem is. And the argument that somehow the problem is the size of government and the amount of spending that's taking place, it's an absurd argument based on the actual economic data that we've seen over the last 11 years. And so I just want to say, to conclude, is that I'm incredibly proud of the work that Jason and his team has done in the White House to sort of go against the winds a little bit of Washington, to have offered a comprehensive as the president said, America, we do big things, right? I think this budget strategy and this economic strategy coming out of the White House was big. It had a big vision for where we need to go in a very different era of the 21st century. Let's hope that the opponents of this can match that strategic response with one that is equal to the task. So far, they haven't. And I think that's really where this debate is going to be over the next few months and, frankly, for years to come. So, Jason, thank you so much for being here. Rob, as always, thank you for your stewardship. Thanks, everybody.